Every family portrait in the Aldermore home carried the same quiet curse: a young man frozen at 21 years old, staring out with the unmistakable gaze of someone who already knew he would never live another day. In the town of Cold Spring, Massachusetts, whispered rumors surrounded the Aldermore estate, a sprawling farmhouse with windows always shut, as if the walls themselves were hiding from daylight. Between 1821 and 1911, 7 Aldermore sons died, each at the age of 21. No illness explained it, no accident could justify the pattern. It was a slow, generational extermination, each death occurring at the cusp of adulthood, as though the family had been bound to a covenant no one dared name. Neighbors described the family's Sunday processions to the old Episcopalian church as funerals in waiting. The boys were tall, pale, and distant, walking with the knowledge that their lives would be brief, their birthdays grave markers. It was said that at night, the Aldermore mother would draw the curtains shut, light 3 candles, and whisper names into a wooden box she kept beneath her bed. When neighbors asked what she prayed for, she only replied, "I pray they pass quickly." Cold Spring forgot most of its tragedies: barn fires, typhoid outbreaks, the winter starvation of 1846. But it never forgot the Aldermores, because every son's death was preceded by the same omen: the tolling of the church bell at an hour when no one touched the rope. And in time the bell tolled for them all. The Aldermores did not speak of their dead. Each passing son was erased quietly, as if the family wished to conceal their lineage rather than preserve it. No headstones were raised. The boys were buried in a private corner of the family plot, where weeds grew tall and the soil seemed unnaturally soft. When the first son, Nathaniel, died in 1821, the town doctor noted his body carried no signs of illness, just a strange discoloration along the fingertips, as though he had been clutching something too tightly. The second, Elias, died in 1834. His lips were blue, though he had not drowned. The third, Thomas, collapsed during a sermon in 1847, his eyes fixed on the church rafters, muttering the words, "They're waiting." By the fourth death, whispers began. Families in Cold Spring pulled their children away from the Aldermores in school. Invitations to dances and harvest gatherings never reached their doorstep. Even tradesmen refused to approach the Aldermore land after sundown. But silence is a kind of inheritance. The Aldermore parents never argued, never wept in public, never questioned why each son fell at the same age. Instead, they seemed to anticipate it, as though their lives were structured around the inevitability of loss. What no one knew then was that the Aldermore name was tied to something older than Massachusetts itself. Their ancestors had fled Europe not to escape poverty or persecution, but to bury a pact. And like all buried things, it demanded to be unearthed. Cold Spring was not a superstitious place. Its townspeople were pragmatic farmers, millers, and fishermen, but the bell, the great black iron bell atop St. Luke's Episcopal, defied explanation. It tolled only at night, once or twice a year, long before the death of each Aldermore son. There were no witnesses to anyone pulling the rope, no footprints in the snow, no candlelight on the ladder leading to the steeple. The sexton swore he locked the tower every evening, yet the bell rang on its own, groaning into the dark like some giant throat warning the town. The sound was not like ordinary bells. Survivors described it as hollow yet wet, carrying a resonance that seemed to crawl beneath the skin, vibrating in the chest cavity. Dogs howled. Horses kicked against their stalls. Infants woke screaming, inconsolable until dawn. For the Aldermores, the tolling was a sentence. Within weeks, the next son would die. His face pale, his hands trembling, his voice muttering things only half understood. One neighbor, Mrs. Godfrey, claimed to hear one of the boys whisper as the bell tolled, "It's not calling me, it's collecting me." Still, the church never investigated. The clergy insisted it was a mechanical error, or boys playing tricks. Though none dared to climb the tower when the ringing began. Every town keeps its secrets. But in Cold Spring, it was not just the Aldermores who kept silent. It was everyone. In 1865, during repairs to the church vestry, a young stonemason uncovered something wedged behind the altar wall, a narrow leather-bound ledger brittle with age. Inside, the entries were written in Latin, though scattered notes in English suggested someone had been translating them. The first pages listed names, strange European surnames dated as far back as 1601. Some names were crossed out, others bore small notations, taken, sworn, fulfilled. And then, beginning in 1799, the Aldermore name appeared. Beside it was written a single chilling phrase, each son 21. The mason, unsettled, handed the book to the pastor. By morning it was gone. When the mason asked after it weeks later, the pastor denied it ever existed, accusing him of drunken invention. Yet others remembered. The man had spoken of the book openly the night he found it. Rumors spread that the ledger belonged not to the church, but to something beneath it. Some said the bell tower had not been built on holy ground, but on older foundations, stones older than the colonies, pulled from burial mounds along the river. And so, as the next Aldermore boy approached his 21st birthday, the town braced itself. Because if the ledger was real, then his death was not chance. It was a ritual. In the Aldermore household, birthdays were not milestones. They were warnings. Neighbors remembered how the family grew silent as each son neared his 21st year. No cakes were baked, no gatherings held, no gifts exchanged. Instead, the boy would spend his final months in isolation, often confined to the house, forbidden to work the fields or attend the town gatherings. A schoolteacher, Miss Catherine Lowe, recalled one boy, Samuel Aldermore, who turned pale when his classmates asked what he wanted for his birthday. He answered softly, "I want to see 22." By the time the day came, the boy was bedridden. He had no fever, no wounds, yet his eyes sank into his skull as though something unseen was feeding from him. On the night of his birthday, the bell tolled, and by morning Samuel was dead. The town doctor wrote only, "No cause discernible. Weakness beyond explanation." Some said the Aldermores never celebrated because they knew celebration was a temptation, the kind of joy that drew the curse closer, the way light draws moths. Others whispered something darker, that the family themselves performed the ritual, that the sons were not victims but offerings. Archival excerpt recorded in 1891 Cold Spring Historical Society transcript. The last boy, Caleb, came to me 3 nights before he passed. He looked exhausted, his face ghostly, but his eyes were alert as though he'd been shown something the rest of us could not see. He said, "Isn't death that comes for us? It's the same thing that came for my great-grandfather in Europe. My blood is only a reminder." When I asked what he meant, he grabbed my hand and whispered, "You'll hear it. When the bell rings, you'll hear the other voices underneath it." And then he walked away, and though resigned, the witness, a farmer named Abel Dern, insisted that when Caleb died, he heard not one bell but many, layers of sound beneath the toll, voices crying out in an unknown tongue. Historians later dismissed the transcript as folklore, arguing that memory is easily corrupted by grief. Yet the original document shows no signs of tampering. The Aldermore deaths were not isolated tragedies, they were patterned, scripted, and, if Caleb's testimony was true, part of a much older inheritance, one the family carried across the ocean. By 1902, suspicion had grown so great that townspeople demanded the Aldermore graves be exhumed. A petition was signed, citing the unnatural pattern of deaths and whispers of ritual. But when the sheriff brought his men to the cemetery, they found the graves disturbed. Each mound had sunk deep as though hollowed from beneath. The coffins were gone. The Aldermore patriarch, old and withered by then, offered no explanation. He only muttered, "We do not keep what was never ours." The sheriff filed no charges. The townspeople asked no further questions, and the case of the missing coffins was buried as quickly as the boys themselves. Yet a letter surfaced years later, written by one of the sheriff's deputies. It described the scene differently. According to the deputy, the graves were not dug up. They had collapsed inward. The earth was wet, almost pulsing, as though it had swallowed the coffins whole. And if that was true, then perhaps the sons were not buried at all. Perhaps they were taken. In Cold Spring, children grew up with a peculiar command from their parents: do not look at the Aldermore house after dark. It wasn't superstition, it was survival. Many claimed that if you stared at the farmhouse windows too long, you'd see more than your own reflection. Neighbors spoke of shadows that didn't move right, outlines of young men pacing in rooms that should have been empty. One girl, Sarah Melrose, wrote in her diary in 1872, "I saw the Aldermore boy staring out of his window, but he had been dead 3 weeks. He raised his hand as though to wave, but when I blinked, the curtain closed by itself. Parents dismissed their children's stories as nightmares, but they kept them indoors after sunset. The Aldermore land was said to hum at night, a faint vibration felt in the soles of the feet, like standing near the tracks before a train arrives. Historians now note that entire generations of townsfolk were conditioned not just to avoid the Aldermores, but to forget them, to erase them from collective memory as though the family itself were a contagion. But forgetting never works. Something always remains. In 1879, the Reverend Josiah Crane, the longest-serving pastor at St. Luke's, vanished. His last sermon, delivered 1 week before his disappearance, was unusually frantic. Witnesses recalled him raising his voice at the congregation. "You pray for mercy, but you do not know what mercy costs. You hear the bell and believe it is warning you. It is not a warning, it is a receipt." That night, he was seen entering the bell tower. He never came back down. When the townspeople searched the tower, they found no trace of him. The door had been locked from the inside. The rope hung untouched. But in the dust near the altar, someone had scrawled 2 words with a trembling hand: "Not ours." The church sealed the tower for nearly 20 years after Crane's disappearance, but the bell rang anyway. At the turn of the century, a traveling photographer offered to document the Cold Spring families. Most welcomed him, except the Aldermores. He claimed that when he finally persuaded them to sit for a portrait in 1904, something unexplainable happened. The negatives showed faint blurs around the sons' faces, streaks of light that resembled hands pulling them backward. When he tried to develop a second plate, it cracked in the solution. A third dissolved entirely, leaving only the faint outline of the church bell etched in the glass. The photographer, shaken, refused to speak of it for years. But in 1919, after the death of the final Aldermore son, he admitted that every negative he shot of the family eventually blackened, as though consumed from within. The town never displayed the photographs. They were locked in the church archives. But after the church fire of 1932, the plates were reduced to ash along with most other records of the Aldermore line, as if the fire was not an accident, but a cleansing. Cold Spring was a struggling settlement in the early 1008, hundreds battered by harsh winters, poor harvests, and outbreaks of disease. Yet, strangely, it prospered when other towns did not. Records show that after every Aldermore death, the town seemed to flourish. The mill brought in more grain, the river ran steady, infant mortality dropped. Even the church pews filled with renewed devotion. It was as if each son's passing guaranteed another decade of survival for Cold Spring. But when researchers questioned this correlation years later, most of the town records were gone, shipment logs missing, birth and death registers damaged, council notes reduced to fragments. Still, enough remained to suggest a chilling pattern. Every sacrifice was followed by prosperity. And if that was true, then perhaps the townspeople were not bystanders at all. Perhaps they were participants, complicit in silence, rewarded for compliance. In 1921, during repairs after a storm, a carpenter discovered a letter stuffed deep into the frame of St. Luke's pulpit. Written in a shaky hand, it appeared to be the confession of Reverend Crane, the pastor who had vanished decades earlier. "They made me ring it. The families demanded it. I told them it was not a warning, but a payment collected. They would not listen. Every toll binds us to the bargain. Every death renews their plenty. The boys were never ours. They belong to what waits below. I will not serve it again. When bell calls next, it will not find me." The carpenter gave the letter to the vestry. By morning it was gone. No copy was kept. But the carpenter's wife testified under oath that she had read it with her own eyes. If Crane's confession was true, then the Aldermore curse was not simply a family affliction. It was a covenant the town upheld. By the 1930s, the Aldermore name had almost vanished from memory. Schoolchildren no longer learned it. Newspapers omitted it. Even gravestones crumbled until the letters could not be read. Yet archivists working decades later noticed something unusual: deliberate erasure, whole pages torn from county records. Tax rolls cut with a blade, church rosters with names scrubbed in ink until the parchment wore thin. Why would a small farming town go to such lengths to erase one family's history? Perhaps because forgetting was safer. Or perhaps because survival demanded it. One chilling margin note remains in the ledger of a town councilman, dated 1907. Do not resist it. The deaths are not tragedy. They are inheritance. Inheritance. A word that bound not just the Aldermores, but all of Cold Spring. During the Prohibition years, workers digging a storage cellar beneath the rectory struck stone foundations deeper than expected. They uncovered a tunnel lined with massive slabs, older than the church itself, leading toward the river. Inside, the air reeked of iron and rot. Scratch marks covered the stone walls, not carved with tools, but gouged as if by fingernails. The workers refused to go further. The tunnel was sealed within days. No record survives of what lay beyond. But a worker's diary surfaced years later. We heard something move, not footsteps, not water. It was like breathing, but too large, too hollow. The priest told us it was the wind. I knew it was not the wind. The final Aldermore son, Henry, lived until 1919. Townspeople noted his strange calm, as if he accepted his fate. On the night before his birthday, the bell tolled 13 times, longer than anyone had ever heard. Witnesses swore the sound was not one bell, but many, layered, echoing, almost mocking. Henry was found in his bed the next morning, his face turned upward, mouth stretched wide as though he had died mid-scream. His body was pale, but his eyes were gone. The doctor recorded simply, death without cause, eyes absent, no blood. And with Henry, the Aldermore line ended. But the town of Cold Spring thrived for another generation. In 1932, St. Luke's Church caught fire. Officially, it was blamed on a lightning strike. But survivors recalled that the blaze began in the sealed bell tower, spreading downward as though flame had poured from above. Every record of the Aldermores, the ledgers, photographs, even Crane's hidden letter, was lost in the inferno. The church was rebuilt, but the tower was never replaced. Some say this was an accident. Others believe the fire was intentional, a final attempt to sever the covenant, to silence the bell forever. Yet a handful of parishioners swore they still heard ringing long after the tower was gone. In 1944, during wartime rationing, a state inspector visited the Cold Spring orphanage. His notes, now declassified, describe something unsettling. The children refuse to sleep near the west windows. They claim they hear the bell in their dreams. One child told me, the Aldermore boys are under the floor calling us by name. Another refused food entirely, saying, I won't eat what they give us. It belongs to the bell. The inspector left abruptly. His report was filed under psychological disturbances. The orphanage was shut down a year later without explanation. In 1950, Dr. Harold Prout, a folklorist from Boston, began compiling a history of Cold Spring. He interviewed surviving townsfolk, collected scraps of records, and even traced the Aldermore lineage back to Europe. Before publishing his findings, he told colleagues, it wasn't a curse, it was a contract, and they didn't break it, they moved it. Prout vanished weeks later. His apartment was left untouched, except for one page pinned to his desk. Do not mistake silence for safety. The bell does not stop when it is hidden, it only waits. To this day, residents of Cold Spring claim to hear the bell. Not often, just once every few decades, always at night, always without a tower. Those who hear it describe the same effect. A vibration in the chest, a taste of iron on the tongue, and a faint whisper under the ringing. Some say the whisper carries names, and while no Aldermores remain, strange tragedies still follow. Young men collapsing inexplicably on their 21st birthdays. Graves that sink inward, prosperity that blooms immediately afterward. The town does not acknowledge it, but the silence feels rehearsed. Narrator, what was the Aldermore family if not proof that blood can be bartered, that an entire town can thrive on the deaths of its own? The photographs are gone. The ledgers burned, the graves swallowed whole, but the rhythm remains, a toll, a death, a renewal. Cold Spring survives because of what was buried, what was bargained, what was fed, and if the bell rings again, whether in that town or another, it will not be a warning. It will be a summons, because the Aldermores were never the end. They were only the beginning.